Well, welcome to our spring membership meeting. It's really wonderful to have all of you here this evening. As always, we're grateful for the support of our membership and especially your enthusiasm for our program. So really, thank you very much for being here tonight. Sorry, some of you got quite damp coming in. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Nick Hunterkamp, I'd like to give you a quick update on the Coast Guard Station project. So if you've ridden by the station recently, you know that a lot is happening down there. The building looks pretty rough because the sidewalks have been removed to make way for walkways that will be ADA compliant. We want to provide learning opportunities on the site, so safe and easy access is very important. The county and the contractor have been very, very cooperative and sensitive to the historic nature of the building. They found extensive wood rot on the front porch, which wasn't expected, but the county commissioners have approved a change order to repair it according to the contractor's plan and Mimi's oversight, so we're very pleased about that. The contractor's due to finish on schedule in August, and at that point we're going to reinstall the old exhibits so that the building can be opened up again and open to the public while we work on new exhibits. So while the county is completing the restoration project over the next few months, the Society has already begun planning for the new museum. We're working with a landscape architect to develop a master plan for the site to make it a beautiful entrance to the East Beach community and one that residents and the community can be proud of. We've already contacted 3 exhibit design firms to start the planning phase for the World War II exhibits. 2 of the designers have developed exhibits for the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And when Don Miller was here in March for his lecture on Masters of the Air, he took a great interest in this project and has put me in touch with Nick Mueller, who's the president of the National World War II Museum. And Nick is going to be assisting us with planning, which is very exciting. The exhibits at the Coast Guard Station are going to be very different from the exhibits that we have in the Keeper's Dwelling. One thing that is going to be very different is we have a lot of oral histories from veterans and others who were here during the war, and they will be used to tell the story of the war on the home front. We also plan to have a lot more interactives for children so that families can enjoy the museum. So there's going to be blimps, Liberty ships, submarines, airplanes, and we hope a radar room. They will all be featured in the new museum. We've met a pilot recently who's involved in the Museum of Aviation in Macon, and he's offered to help because he firmly believes that the significance of this area's contribution to the war effort has never been fully recognized. So he's particularly excited about the project. And let's not forget the archaeology lab. The exhibit designer is also going to be looking at ways to tell the story of the lab and to convey the importance of archaeology in discovering the history of our area. An outdoor classroom for children will also be an important part of the plan. So the development of an exhibit plan and a landscape plan should be complete by the end of the summer. And at that time, the designers will be able to give us detailed cost estimates and several visuals that we can use to start fundraising this fall. The Development Committee expects the fundraising to take approximately 12 to 18 months. And since we've already received some generous gifts to cover the exhibit design, the landscape plan, and the outdoor classroom for kids, we're able to move ahead on the project while we organize the fundraising. The plan is to open the new museum in the spring of 2018. And that may sound like a long time away, but there's a lot of work to be done. And the more and more we research all the activities that took place here during the war, the more excited we become about the possibilities of engaging all areas in a nationally significant part of our history. So with that update, I would like to now introduce our speaker, Dr. Nick Hunterkamp. Nick is a full-time professor at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and he directs the Institute of Archaeology there. He's been engaged in archaeological research on historic and prehistoric sites in the Southeast for over 40 years. Nick is especially interested in plantation archaeology in Georgia, and one of his recent publications, which was co-authored with the late Ray Crook, is on research at Behavior Cemetery on Sapelo Island. His plantation research has also taken him to Morel Plantation on Ossabaw and Cannons Point here on St. Simons. During these projects, Nick is using the archaeology lab down at the Coast Guard Station as his classroom, where he's taught students in artifact processing and methodology. As the consulting archaeologist to the Historical Society, Nick is overseeing all the work at the lab, including bringing the lab up to professional curation standards. Nick, the Society is truly grateful for your expertise and your oversight. I'd like to just take a minute to ask Myrna Crook to stand up. I know she's going to hate this. Sorry, Myrna. And I just want to publicly recognize your contribution to the lab, Myrna. And Myrna is there day to day, running that lab and overseeing the lab and reporting to Nick, and we're truly grateful, Myrna. And also Scott Clark is here. You want to put your hand up, Scott? Scott is our intern who is Myrna's able assistant. So thank you, Scott, for the work that you've been doing for us, too. Okay, so when Nick is not in the field or the classroom, he's an avid runner and biker, both road and mountain, and he plays the electric bass in 3 different bands in Chattanooga: the Lumbar 5, the Pool, and the Loop. So it got a bit loud when you all got in the room, but when you were first arriving, some of you may have heard some music playing in the background. Well, that was actually Nick playing with the Pool. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Society's consulting archaeologist, Dr. Nick Hunterkamp.
Okay, first, I want to thank you for your kind introduction, and I want to thank the Society for having me and inviting me with this opportunity to talk about something I'm intensely interested in, and it looks like there's a whole room full of people who share that same interest, which is great to see that. So I'm honored. I truly am honored. In putting together my presentation, I was trying to think back the last time I spoke in public on St. Simons Island, and that was at Fort Frederica National Monument in 1986 for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the fort. Were any of you there? No, you're all too young. So what stuck in my mind, it was a big deal. The Fort Frederica Association had a number of programs going on for the celebration, and I was part of it. And they had a wine and cheese before I gave my comments. I did my dissertation on sites at Frederica, and I guess that's why they asked me. And this was an opportunity for me to invite my father to come hear me give a presentation. He'd never really fully understood what I did for a living. And he had a restaurant, Main Street restaurant, donut shop in Jacksonville, Florida. And so it was close by, and I said, why don't you come in here? And so he did. And halfway through the presentation, I noticed he was asleep, which I attribute to sophisticated adult beverages that were served at that reception. At any rate, I'd like to think that if he could have been here now, he would not fall asleep. That's what I hope. Okay, so tonight, let's see if this works. Yes. I'm going to focus on 2 questions. Where did slaves live? And directly related to that question, under what conditions did they live? And my enthusiasm for learning the answers to these questions was, I think, inherited in part from Charles Fairbanks, who was my mentor at the University of Florida. And he framed these questions in a broader sense by pointing out basically there, up until the 1960s or 70s, there was only one history about plantations. It consisted mostly of what was written about affluent landowners and how they lived. Not the average planter. The average planter in Georgia had 6 slaves in 1860, but the higher class of planter. They could afford to be literate themselves and to hire literate people to write things about them, mostly complimentary things. For the slaves, not so much. Now, why is that? This is going to be an active learning experience. Why is it, do you think, that there aren't many slave accounts at all? There's the WPA, Drums and Shadow book, Fanny Kemble diary, which I'm going to quote from tonight. But in fact, there were very few and far between sources of information on slaves. Why do you think that is? Right. Yeah. Why bother? Why would slave owners want to have something written about slaves? They were doing the work. That's all they cared about. So it's rare to find these accounts. They're often biased, as you might imagine, or contradictory. So the result was there's one history that was developed at the expense of another. The silent history of slaves, which their history was grossly incomplete and, unfair. And how to redress this disparity, Fairbanks said one way to do it is to go below ground instead of relying on above ground sources. That means get out there and dig and look at the material remains of slaves. Which his students did do that, and I'm one example of that. And he included cabins, digging up cabins, not just the big house. So basically it became a moral cause to engage in plantation archaeology and to bring to light this missing history. So armed with missionary zeal, I started looking seriously at plantation sites a decade ago, and I was confronted with 2 immediately apparent problems, disparities, I guess you'd say. First, problem number 1 was the number of documented slaves that came from census information, which was usually generally reliable, associated with any particular plantation, almost never matched the on-the-ground evidence of where they lived. The slave cabins were missing for large numbers of slaves that were documented but not found archaeologically. And second thing, when maps do show slave settlements, they mess it up. Cabin locations are often in error when they show up at all. Well, not good. None of that's good. Suffice it to say that it's pretty much impossible to reconstruct basic plantation landscape, settlement patterns, and living conditions, let alone more esoteric questions like the creolization process that some slaves might have gone through, or the resistance that slaves had to creolization, which is an even more fascinating subject. You can't do that without knowing where the slaves live and an accurate understanding of where they live. So to illustrate these fundamental problems, I'll be looking at plantation settlements on 3 barrier islands, St. Simons, Sapelo, and Ossabaw. I'm thinking I don't need a map of Cannons Point to anyone in this room, but I like to see what a preserve looks like and what one doesn't look like. And this is a great example of that. I don't even need to put the label on there. What it means is that big long line of green is things are being preserved there. Cannons Point Preserve preserves nature and culture from development, which you can see on the other side of the creek. So that's good. There's artifacts and features that are not subjected to developmental pressures thanks to the St. Simons Land Trust. The Cooper Plantation at the north end of this slide will always be associated with the pioneering work of John Solomon Otto. He was a student of Charles Fairbanks, and he was the first archaeologist to systematically compare planter, overseer, and slave material culture to define status differences. So he's doing a three-way comparison based on artifacts derived from the middens of planters, overseers, and slaves. What are middens? Trash piles. Yeah, good. Man, I'll trade you in for my class any day. Yeah, they're trash deposits, areas where trash, and they occur prehistorically and historically. Well, John found where those middens were and then sampled them from the three areas. Then he got down to comparing and contrasting. That was the first time that had ever been done. What he was doing was trying to look for evidence of class distinctions that were made in the material realm, rather than just relying on books about those subjects. So he looked at such things as, you know, a real drawback to being an archaeologist is you see the aging process very explicitly, and it's not pretty. So here's what are found in middens. Food bones. Butchering marks on these food bones in planter and overseer, and there are different types of food that end up in different middens. For instance, the only place at Cannons Point that had butchered cat remains was the overseer's house, surprisingly enough. But other things like, of course, housing, that's Cooper's House foundations. Ceramics, which go real well together with foodways. Oh, my daughter got me this cool as ever pointer. It's in the shape of an arrowhead. How great is that? Oh, look at there. So, container bottles, personal items, clothing, I mean, the list goes on and on. And it put that study, put plantation archaeology on the map, and it was done here at Cannons Point. It's still a vibrant field of historical archaeology. But to do what John Otto did first required finding where the Cannons Point slaves lived. The enslaved workforce was brought to Cannons Point, of course, by planter John Cooper. According to census information, Cooper possessed an average of 116 slaves over his 30 years of planting Sea Island cotton. And based on an 1869 U.S. Coast Survey map, Otto produced this map with 4 South End slave duplexes. I don't know, can you see those little dots? Okay, trust me. There's 4 little dots that represent slaves, slave cabins. There's 4 more up by Cooper's plantation right there. Boy, I should have made this a lot bigger. And that third dot, single dot, is the overseer's house. So he was able to identify where these slave cabins were. And he excavated one of the north end cabins, and the overseer's house, of course, and the planter's house. So he had samples from all 3. While Sue McFarland, another archaeologist at the University of Florida, dug at one of the duplexes on the south end. Neither Otto nor McFarland addressed the problem of cramming approximately 116 slaves into 12 small structures that are represented on this map, as both had other research questions to pursue. So where are the rest of the cabins? Jumping to Sapelo Island presents a different problem. Thomas Spalding was an extremely successful planter, and according to the 1850 census, he owned 293 slaves, although an unknown number of them worked on the mainland. They produced Sea Island cotton and sugar as the main cash crops. A reconnaissance of Sapelo Island map was completed in 1857 by H.S. Duval, and it provided detailed information about the island's cultural landscape. On it, Spalding's South End holdings at the very near his mansion, where the Reynolds Mansion is today, including, it included 3 settlements, and the one I'm going to look at right now is a line of cabins that are next to a field. There's the field still there today. This is an overlay of that early map on Google. There's the mansion. So the slave cabins, and Ray Crook was the first to notice these. They're kind of hard to see, but he numbered them. So those slave cabins are between the field and the mansion, Spalding's mansion. While the number of slaves residing in these documented cabins is unknown, we searched like crazy for the mapped-in line of cabins near the mansion, and we couldn't find a single one, despite the fact that our archaeological survey of this area, those little dots are half-meter test pits, and so we went along where we thought that overlay indicated cabins were. Want to see what we found? Nothing. This is one of our half-meter test pits with a profile. Do you see any artifacts in there? Me neither. Now multiply it times 80 and try to keep your students enthusiastic. So mostly empty half-meter screen test pits. Later maps do not show, let me go back to that. Yeah, later maps don't show those cabins at all. So what's going on here? Are there cabins there, or did they not exist? As a third example, we're going to move up to Ossabaw Island to a plantation with a workforce of 63 slaves that initially produced indigo, but then later shifted to cotton. It was owned by Brian Morrell. There's the plantation area which had some slave cabins in it. That's the best I could do. He apparently didn't sit for a painting. But according to this nautical chart of Ossabaw Sound, which I've, let me go back. There, yeah, we'll come to it. See those slave cabins in line? They should be right along there. And there's the mansion. So there's a line of cabins. Here we go with the line again. Planters like to put their cabins in lines. Can you think of why that would be? Well, they're enforcing their will about settlement patterning, but that's for reconnaissance. That's to keep people in view, and we see it over and over again on the coast, with a few exceptions that I'm going to talk about. There's 9 structures here that apparently incorporate into the line 3 extant tabby duplexes that were occupied by African slaves and then Gullah Geechee families and others up until the late 20th century. And these obviously are restored. Architectural historians believe the tabbies were built in the 1840s. However, despite 2 intensive field sessions and 150 survey test pits at the site, no signs of foundations or chimney falls mark the location of the other 6 presumed. And we went along that line. You can see there's the line established by the extant tabbies. So there should be something along here, along that blue marks. Red was 1 year and blue was the next summer. And we found artifacts, but we didn't find structural remains of any kind. So once again, some slave cabins are showing up on a map but are missing on the ground. Okay. In all 3 of these examples, map inaccuracies or outright omissions are plausible explanations for the discrepancies between maps and archaeological remains. But I would also include another concept, and I call it archaeological myopia as a contributing factor, and I'll explain that in just a second. First, I digress. I want to define what a cabin is in this region. This is a regional survey that we're doing tonight. What is meant by cabin? Slave homes on the 3 islands showed considerable variability as cabin construction changed through time and space. Let me go back to this is an example of a poured tabby duplex at Hamilton Plantation that you might recognize. They're the most visible variant. On Sapelo, this version takes the form of at least 9 central chimney duplexes that were built at Chocolate Plantation. A rare discussion of this slave housing occurred in 1821, in which planter Edward Swarbeck describes and explains his reasons for constructing such substantial cabins. Swarbeck emphasized the durability of tabby cabins, and this is a quote, "It makes my Negroes more comfortable, and I desire to leave my estate as valuable as possible for those who may inherit it. Tabbies certainly dominate the modern landscape at Chocolate and at the Morel plantation on Ossabaw. But both plantations had several owners. This is important. Both of those plantations had owners that preceded Morel and Swarbuck, and none of them used tabby. So that forces us to recognize there had to be different types of cabins in both those cases. That also includes Thomas Spalding, which is kind of surprising since he was a big adherent of tabby. But the exclusive focus on tabby cabins is what I refer to as the low-hanging fruit of plantation archaeology. And more archaeological myopia. The expectation is there should be tabby cabins. And that precludes looking for anything else, basically. So there might be a mix of housing types over time. As a matter of fact, I would expect that. I'm saying this like I am a big smarty pants, but it took a while for me to get to this point. I have no need for tabby envy. In fact, wood frame cabins were the most common type of, on all three of the islands. On St. Simon's, Fanny Kimball mentions that at Butler Point Plantation, slaves lived in mere wooden frames pinned to the earth by a brick chimney. Often such structures were elevated on blocks like you see here made of brick, but it could also be wood or tabby. And they contained end or central chimneys of bricks, tabby, or clay and sticks. Cannons Point slave cabins were of this type. I've never seen any mention of cast iron stoves in slave cabins, but they were possibly used on the coast. By 1820, cast iron step-top cook stoves were introduced and began to steadily replace fireplaces. Throughout the United States. If stoves were used, they would leave precious little in the archaeological record to signal the presence of a cabin. Since such cabins are so hard to find, they tend to be automatically overlooked by archaeology. There goes that myopia again. More rarely, a third type of cabin was made of wattle and daub, but with the daub composed of tabby mortar and the wattle made from grapevines interwoven through wall posts. The roofs were thatched, as shown in this remarkable drawing, which has as the author Crook. Is that Myrna? Ray? Is there anything Ray didn't do? Okay, well, it's just an incredible drawing, and it's based on archaeological reality, which is even more cool. He excavated two of these wattle and daub structures at Bush Camp Field and behavior sites. Both were small, rectangular in shape, and contained no evidence of indoor fireplaces whatsoever. According to Ray, and this is a quote, they were essentially African huts creatively modified for life on a Georgia coastal plantation. Also, probably consistent with common African usage, their small cabins would have served primarily as shelter, with cooking and many other household activities taking place in the yard. Interestingly, an account by a slave named Okra that was published in Drums and Shadows indicates African-influenced structures at Cannons Point were prohibited by John Cooper's son, James, who ordered that Okra tear down a cabin that he had built because it was too African. Okay, why would African architecture be a problem, do you think? Anybody want to try that?
Make them homesick.
Make them homesick, and then what? They don't like it there. Maybe there's a slave revolt. So Charles Fairbanks started his journey on plantation archaeology by looking for Africanisms, some evidence of material culture that related directly to African traditions or spirituality or something like that. He didn't find any. And it may be because planners had a genetic distrust of that kind of solidarity that might accrue from Africanism by reference to Africa. Even if it's basically this is a free house for James Cooper. It would be built by Okra, and he had it torn down. I think there's some paranoia that is exhibited here. And I'm fascinated with how very different the patterns of slave settlements between Spalding and other coastal planners appeared. Spalding had no problem with slaves building African-derived cabins of local materials, as he ultimately saved money doing so. And he also gave each family a certain amount of autonomy as to where their cabins, not just what type of cabins they had, but where they were located. He was an early proponent of live where you work, and allowed slaves to live far from the mansion, that's for sure. As this map shows. No, that's not it. There we go. It was like my life just went before my eyes. No, it's the nightmare and the miracle of digital technology. All right, so this is the right map. Spalding apparently felt no need to arrange cabins in straight lines to enhance surveillance of his workforce, as was done at Cannons Point and Ossabaw. It's a good example of housing autonomy and independence and self-sufficiency. Look at behavior. These are really adjacent to each other. Behavior has, what do you think those represent? Those little rectangles. Maybe fences, a corral, a pen, animal pens. So there's 3 of them that had that attached to them. Look at, these aren't in a line, they're scattered all over the place, but in both areas. So he's allowing them to set up their own settlements in a way that's familiar to them, apparently, which was, I think that's what Ray called them, as settlements, or villages, little small villages that are reminiscent of their patterns in Africa. He also used, here's another example of his, what's called a light approach to slavery, if that's not an oxymoron. He used the task system of labor instead of the gang system. Does anybody know the difference? Task is what? When you finish your task, you're done for the day, you can do whatever you want, as opposed to the gang system where you had a supervisor or a driver who kept you going, and you had no control over your amount of work or time devoted to it. So that's another example. His most famous overseer was an African named Bilali, who was a practicing Muslim. This approach to slavery is inevitably seen as paternalistic benevolence, but keep in mind that it also increased plantation profits. When Spalding learned, what he learned, the way I summarize this, what he learned was that the less he treated his slaves as slaves, the more productive they were. And I think that's why he was one reason he was so successful compared to other planners. Now let's go to Cannons Point and the missing cabins there. It's clear that the cabins needed to house the consistently large slave populations on this plantation, as indicated by census data. Substantially outnumber the cabins present on this single historic map. This is a little bit later, but we can assume these are representing the same cabins. There's the north. I should have used this as the first one. You can actually see it. So there's the north cabin that John Otto excavated, and then the south cabins that Sue McFarland excavated. And with 116 slaves on the average, there's a problem. There's only 8 structures that are being represented here. However accurate the map may have been when it was drawn. Map makers had more incentives to get significant cultural information right, meaning that locational accuracy and detail was biased toward planners, especially their mansions and structures shown here as dots that make up what Otto called see that top oval, what Otto calls the administrative and technical nucleus of plantations. It's also where Cooper lived. In contrast, slave cabins often seem to be mapping afterthoughts. Also, map makers might simply not know where out-of-the-way cabins were found, and cabins, especially frame cabins, can disappear over time, leaving nothing to map. And much like modern-day textbooks, I can vouch for this, Errors can become embedded and repeated in subsequent maps by lazy cartographers. Finally, Norma Harris keeps pointing out to me that at least some slaves probably lived in barns and other seemingly technical structures, like up there in the top oval, which would account for the unexpected quantities all the time. This happens every time, it seems like, of domestic artifacts like broken sherds and food bone and glass fragments that are found at these sites. You're not supposed to be living in them, but the artifacts that come from the ground around them indicate that's precisely what was going on. But that's another talk. Okay. All right. Thanks to a widespread pine beetle infestation, several acres in the preserve were recently clear-cut to remove infected trees. That's somewhere in the 600 acres. Surface collections made by Myrna and a metal detection survey of the cleared area directed last fall by Lindsay Cochran indicated the presence of 8 artifact clusters that are probably associated with slave cabins. So this is a major discovery. The suspected cabins are arranged in a roughly linear arrangement, just like the others were. Unfortunately, due to potential looting by artifact collectors, I'm not supposed to show their locations. The hotspots probably represent cabins that were either missed by the 1869 map maker in that previous map, or they didn't exist at that date. In 1824, a hurricane hit the island hard, and that may be responsible for their absence. But I'm going to make a prediction. More undocumented cabins are expected to be found. Are expected to be found in the future at Cannons Point. Okay. All right, missing cabins. What is going on? All right, missing cabins at Sapelo South End. Map inaccuracy is what I'm going to offer as a reason for the missing Spalding site cabins. Not the behavior in New Barn Creek, but the very south end near his mansion. The systematic survey of the area where the line of cabins was supposed to occur yielded next to nothing in 2008. However, as we were leaving the site that summer, a sharp-eyed field school student spotted a single sherd of transfer printed Purware on the surface at a considerable distance south of where we'd been doing all those test pits. So the next summer, based on one sherd, we went back and began again. The survey revealed post holes. Those are from some kind of structure, earth fast structure. Personal items, including, well, and a gunflint, but buttons, what else? Different types of buttons, including a bone button, which is consistent with slave buttons. And neatest of all, in terms of personal items, 4 beads in this new area that we were looking at. The new area, the artifacts and features are believed to represent the location of missing line of slave cabins that showed up in that map. 70 meters off the projected map location. The same map shows the nearby Spalding mansion very accurately located. Coincidence? I don't think so. This seems to be a pretty clear example of the selective bias in mapping accuracy. We also believe that individual cabins are represented by the constant contrast between ceramics and nails at this site. This is where I love PowerPoint. Watch this. This is that little circle right there. Pretend you don't see it. That just shows where those post holes were, I believe. But this is cut nails, and this is called a heat map, and the high density areas are in red, and the low density or nothing is in green. Okay, so we can see some high density areas for nails. I think this was a shed of some kind, not a slave cabin. But where we thought the slave cabins were right there, they're down. We think they're now down here. Now contrast this cut nail heat map with the ceramic one. They're kind of inverse to each other. Let me do that again. There's the nails, there's the ceramics. So I could do this all night. Because it's cool. And what I think is going on is that the nails represent what archaeologists call nail rain. When the cabin disintegrated or burned, the nails go like that. Okay? But not the ceramics. They're not in that cabin that's up on posts, has a floor. And so those ceramics are not in the house when they're used up or broken. They're thrown outside. This has actually been quantified in South Carolina. It's called the Brunswick pattern of refuse disposal, where people throw things out their doors or windows or find a place in the backyard to throw it. I lived in a neighborhood where that was very common, now that I think about it. So let's go to Ossabaw North End missing cabins. What are the missing? Where? What about them? Recall that the historic map showed a straight line of 9 structures that include the 3 tabby duplexes and probably represent the homes of slaves, followed by Gullah Geechee residents. Thus, at least 6 structures have gone missing according to this map. There's not 9 poor tabby residences, there's only 3. So something else is going on. A small interval survey, as you saw, failed to detect any architectural remains suggesting that cabins were elevated on wood frame construction. Such frame cabins would be expected to leave little, if any, traces in the archaeological record, especially if the corner piers were recycled after cabins collapsed or burned. And if residents of such structures use cast iron stoves for cooking and heat, no remnant fireplace or chimney falls would be present. Locating such structures is a considerable challenge since they leave little obvious architectural features behind. One way to address this problem is to attempt to identify the elusive wooden cabin locations using artifact density maps, like I showed you, but I'm going to show you a different kind that I think is just as cool. Instead of searching for non-existent foundations, we use domestic and architectural related artifacts, ceramics, glass, nails, that sort of thing. And found a line of frequency peaks for ceramics, container glass, and then cut nails. Now, they're not perfectly aligned. They're not all on top of each other. I'd be the first to admit that. But something's going on here. There's a tendency that is very clear in these peaks. A linear series of concentrations for ceramics and glass and cut nails. While the peaks and valleys aren't identical, they're close. And they indicate a consistent depositional tendency that aligns well with the tabby duplexes and, at the other end, the Morrell Mansion. It seems highly unlikely that these concentrations represent random refuse deposits that by chance parallel these extant features. Instead, I suggest that these linear concentrations are sheet deposits that are associated with refuse from corner pier frame cabins that probably contain stoves rather than chimneys. If so, different types of cabins were present at the same time at this plantation. It took me a while to get my head wrapped around that, but that's what I think is going on here. It's the only way to account for the 3 tabbies and the 6 other structures. I also suggest that systematic surveys may be an effective way to indirectly tease out the presence of such elusive slave structures. It's labor intensive, I think, to do this. You have to put a lot of holes in the ground. I want to end by making some declarative statements. Now, that's rare. Most archaeologists use seems to or could or probably, weasel worms. And so it's rare, but I'm going to stick my neck out. That the lack of correspondence between documented slave populations and the physical remnants of their homes at coastal plantations should be an indication to archaeologists and historians alike that a lot more cabins await discovery. Maps represent only single moment snapshots of slave, planter, and overseer landscapes, something that was obvious at Cannon's Point. They also can be flat out wrong, often as a result of mapper bias or laziness, as was seen at Spalding Plantation. And the cabins that historic maps do represent may not be consistent through time or space, as indicated by the survey results at Ossabaw. All 3 of these examples present above and below ground challenges for identifying where slaves lived on the Georgia coast. It is incumbent on archaeologists to do away with myopia and meet these challenges. Thank you. I have been instructed by Sherry to take questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said that the Wattle and Daub structure with the thatch roof was daubed with tabby?
With tabby mortar, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, and that's what,
Oyster shell house?
yeah, it's, I mean, Wattle and Daub, most people think of prehistoric structures in this area, but this was, Ray Crook argued that this was an example of creolization. It was combining new world materials in an old world form. And I think he was right. I think he was dead right. My physical this summer is going to be in that same site looking for more of this cabin. What else?
My grandchildren and my daughter, they have in Swaziland, Africa, and in Nairobi, Kenya, they have 2 orphanages that they formed. And my grandchildren went there and got a real education in relationships to the slave cabins. She said to me, Olivia came to me, she says, "Papa, do you know that they live in houses made out of poop?" And I said, "No, I didn't." And I said, "Why do they do that?" He said that the lions don't come in there and eat them. So I guess there's reason and purposes for it. I think the cabin knows.
Sounds like it's worth it to me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you find any artifacts that you didn't expect in the slave era?
Yeah, we find them all the time, and the question is, are they hand-me-downs, or how did they come to acquire these unique artifacts? And let's see. Now you're going to pin me down and ask me which artifact I'm talking about. Well, at Ospah we found the base of a wine goblet, a crystal wine goblet, in what looks like a slave area. But when we looked at it closer, it had U square on the edge. So we think it was being used as a scraper, repurposed as a scraper from planter to slave. And that was absolutely cool to see that. The other thing is that it's not really rare, but to come across, like at the south end of South Loop, to come across a pipe stem that I know an enslaved African used is just a thrill to me. I mean, you can use pipe stems to date the site, but it adds a personal dimension when you see those very personal items. So those beads that I showed you, and just something as simple as a pipe stem. Somebody was addicted to tobacco, you know, and it brings more of a humanistic sort of feeling, and it's not all just science.
Well, I was thinking in Mount Vernon, they found one, if I remember correctly, in one of the cabins, they knew one of the fellows was a hunter because he had a rifle.
Oh, thanks. What Charles Fairbanks would always say to his students is he never, actually, he all over the southeast, or in Georgia, Florida, and he never found a slave cabin that didn't have musket balls or gun flints. And they were supposed to be illegal to give slaves guns, I think in every southern state, but they always show up, and the explanation is trusted slaves were given that as a reward, and they could go out and hunt or whatnot. But there's my prime example of unexpected find.
You did show a flip.
Yeah, I did show that gun to him. I thought that was neat.
We do know that the slaves on Sappho were armed in War of 1812.
Yeah, I do believe I remember hearing that.
To defend the island.
Yeah. Was that
Small.
Spalding? Yeah. Well, there you go. It's paying off, isn't it? His treatment of slaves. Really, the more I learned about Spalding, he was different. That's for sure. You know, a lot of it you think is hype because every planter is a kind planter. But Spalding, yeah, he was. He's the only one that allowed that kind of settlement pattern, and that's an expression of autonomy and individualism. And a lot of planners and overseers wanted to have to go away. They wanted regimented workers, not people who were doing things on their own. But Spalding saw how to make the best of it. He didn't care for it. I mean, he thought it was unfair. And the only way he could make money is by having slaves. And he recognized that. But there's different types of slavery. So what Roswell King offered up is very different than what Thomas Spalding offered up.
Boy, on the subject of Sapelo, it's not the only place the tax system.
Oh, no, that's all over the
It's all
southeast.
down.
Yeah, that's over the southeast. Interestingly, there's more gang on the mainland side than there is on, other planners certainly had tax systems because it made economic sense to do so. It provided incentive. I always keep thinking in terms of what's making money, because that's what's driving all of this. I mean, it's not philosophical at all. It's economics. And it's fascinating to see how all the different approaches that planners use to try to obtain the same result. Spalding was one of the more successful.
A question regarding your second of the basic questions,
Yeah.
which was what conditions were there.
They're living under.
If you compared the owner's residence and the overseer's residence to that of slaves below ground,
Yeah.
what declarative statements could you make about the difference you found between those two groups?
I would point you towards John Otis' book. And he found a small 16 by 20 duplex, or 16 by 20, I think, slave cabins on the north end, on piers with chimneys. And compared to the overseer's house, I don't know if you've seen it on a tour of Cannons Point, it is spectacular. It is the fanciest, biggest, most impressive overseer's house I've ever seen. It. I call it a show house, a show overseer's house, because it's so elaborate. And that may have been a way that Cooper could demonstrate his wealth and his management of his property. And then he had this huge, sprawling mansion that we can see today. The thing to keep in mind is every single thing you see coming up above as the foundation was built by a slave. Every stick was put there by a slave, and that's why there needs to be a slave history, because they're the ones that built these plantations. What else?
One more, if I may.
You may.
You said that their slave quarters were in a line for observation and control.
And surveillance, right?
But I'd always thought that was a good way for the owner to display his wealth and to have visitors there going by quarter, cabin after cabin, on his way to the main house.
I think that's a great idea, and I think it might be 2 for 1.